Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out in the cold, those of you that came in with coats on. Very excited to have with us today Joe Kozrowski, who is the Senior Director of Technology for the Hennepin County, Ramsey County, and MSBA associations. Joe has a JD from William Mitchell and an MBA from St. Thomas, and did his undergraduate work in math and computer science at St. John's University. Please help me welcome Joe.
Thanks. So this topic is something I was looking at for a while. I went to Stanford has their Future Law Codex program, and they talked a lot about chatbots. And they started getting into big data and some of those things. And so I thought the question is how is your bot biased, your technology biased? It would be interesting to explore that. But once you start looking into it, it's a pretty easy question to answer. So the answer is yes, there's a lot of bias in technology and in data. So it wasn't a real hard to look into that, but I think there's a lot of interesting topics that come out of that question. So at the Bar Association, the Bar Associations, I'm the Senior Director of Technology, which includes online services, which is our program services and partnerships to help members with the practice of law, but it also includes our internal technology, the infrastructure and the stuff we use to run our programs and run the association. So I get to go to things like ABA Tech Show to see what's coming out on the kind of the practice of law side of it, and then like some things with the Stanford programs, which are a little more theoretical. So this really allowed me to bring a lot of that together and see how much overlap there is, and look at some of the assumptions and some of the things that people need to be aware of when they're using technology and big data, and the effect it has on access to justice and the practice of law. So when you think about bots or technology or artificial intelligence, you get the friendly but limited robots. You get the ones that are evolving but are still somewhat limited or constrained, and then you get the more ominous ones. And so you look at this is where technology thinks it knows more, knows better than you do. Sadly, this is probably where a lot of technology is headed, just because of the way it is created. Technology doesn't evolve naturally, at least not here. It's a big universe out there. But because it is written and constructed and rules-based, it's going to be very structured. And so, those rules can have unintended consequences or move technology in a very rigid position. So going back, half a century, the way to determine whether technology was going to be, evolving, or if it was artificial intelligence, what level, there's the Turing test, which actually, if you get into what it was actually can the technology fool a single person into believing? So you can't tell the difference between a person and a computer. It's used a little more generically now to be a kind of a threshold. So here you can see basically you have a single person asking questions of a computer and also a person, and so to pass the test, basically the person C wouldn't be able to tell the difference between them. And so, this is a quote, saying it's coming pretty soon, where there may be a threshold where we get beyond that point. Singularity is a word that's thrown around a lot. That's kind of a point where AI grows exponentially. Once AI is as intelligent as humans, it can basically evolve and develop itself. So at that point, because computers or technology has more resources, it can evolve at an exponential rate, whereas if humans are controlling the development, it's a much more linear growth. So once you get that singularity, you'd see exponential growth in intelligence from AI, and that's where you start seeing the sci-fi movies where the robots take over. But there's been systems around that have been trying to simulate artificial intelligence. ELIZA is a very old, well, not, relatively old, very old by computer standards anyway. And they're basically a triggered off keywords. So you could write whatever you want, but if there are certain words in your text, it would generate a canned response. So it would look like it's intelligent, but you could just put the word out of context. So you go back to some teachers grading a history exam. If you put the right dates and words in, the rest of it didn't matter. They just go circle. Yep, you had the date, you had the battle. Yep, that's 3 points. So that's kind of how ELIZA did it. It just looked for keywords. Now you've also got specialized AI that are very good and very deep at one thing, But like here, this particular AI would be good at witting Jeopardy, but may not be good at driving a car. So you don't have kind of the general intelligence or the flexibility with what they can do. So why do we care? Among other things, the rules of professional conduct say that lawyers need to stay abreast of changing technology and how it affects the practice of law, benefits and risks. But beyond that, and we'll get into this a little more, is that time is finite, but technology is not. So lawyers are humans. There's one of them. You're an individual. You have 24 hours a day. I mean, there's a very finite amount of work that you can do. But technology doesn't have that limitation. It can reproduce itself. One bot could spawn thousands of them. You can have the same piece of software. It's not like Microsoft generates a million different versions of Office. It writes it once and then copies it and distributes it. So if it's in the cloud, they don't even copy it anymore, really. So technology really removes some of the limits on what's possible and what sort of services are possible. Some of the questions you get with technology is unauthorized practice of law. So as these technology solutions come in, to try to solve some of the problems, including, access to justice, people who can't get, the legal help they need. The question is, can we prevent it because it's unauthorized practice of law? It's not the same service. They're not lawyers. But then you look at some of the other analogies to other industries. So Napster, file sharing, swapping music, things like that, that was shut down. Because illegal copyright, all sorts of, you can get into the case law if you want, but iTunes had a similar model, but what they did differently is they worked with the people that owned the recordings. And so because they worked in a different way, they were basically able to offer the same service without running into the same legal issues. And you look at Uber, people talk about the Uberization of law, but Uber there again is, the taxi drivers, had kind of their monopoly, you had the medallions in New York, things like that, and then you come in with something like Uber, that just puts, kind of flips it on its head. Technology comes in, finds a better way to do it or a more efficient way to do it, and the cab drivers no longer have influence over the industry. And so the other side of this is that if lawyers don't adapt or aren't aware of and aren't working with these technology companies, are they going to become obsolete or becoming, just trying to get back into the conversation? So that's the other thing to be aware of is that, in Silicon Valley, they see this opportunity. They're always looking for the next big thing, the next Google, the next Facebook, whatever. And so if they see an opportunity, they're going to try to fill it. And so to stay relevant, I think lawyers need to be involved in that conversation. So, looking at some of the diversity things and the way the profession currently breaks down, this is a couple years old now, but this is kind of how, lawyer demographics across the United States. 1.3 million lawyers. The average age is 49. 88% of lawyers were white. You can look at 64% were men. You can see that about half were in private practice, things like that. So this is just kind of a general snapshot of where the profession was at the time. This is some other stuff from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's a lot of numbers, so I'm not going to read through all of it. But you can kind of see how they change over time and how the demographics have slightly trended up for the percentage of female lawyers, for example, is going up. And this is broken down compared to other professions. This is, you can get this, the slide deck I think will be available or whatever if you want. Otherwise, you can Google it too. U.S. judges. So here you can see, there's some. It's not a straight line, at least by gender diversity. So 2015 wasn't a particularly good year there compared to 2014. But then there's other measures. So that traditionally a lot of times you're looking at head count. Just men versus women, or whatever your metric is, or however many classifications you have. Docket Alarm, which was acquired by Fastcase last year, did a presentation for us last April, and they used a different measure of diversity, specifically with IP and technology. They went in and they looked at not only head count, but who was the attorney of record and who was actually making the arguments. So not just how diverse does the team look, but how diverse is the team that's actually doing the substantive legal work. And so they went into all the pleadings throughout the various U.S. district courts, and so they found the notice of appearance by female attorneys in Ohio Northern was the most highest percentage. Minnesota was much lower at 26%. By case type, you can see civil rights had the highest percent, but still not a majority. Patent was a much lower percentage. And then they looked at win rates to try to determine, does the gender affect the outcome of the case? They didn't find there was any correlation here, as you can kind of see that from the scatter plot. Technology also can make it easier to access legal services. So just a few examples, you have the ADA, but also there's certain things like when you're designing a website, if you're using images or emails, make sure you have alt text. If people like email programs block the image, or if there's a screen reader, the screen reader can't, describe the image, so you need the alt text or some sort of way to convey the same meaning. Google Translate's probably more prominent now, but Alta Vista had a translate service back in the day. Court Call's a service out there that a few judges are using. E-filing, which most people here might be familiar with, is something that makes it easier to access documents, but hopefully standardizes things too. Live deposition is another example of a service that's coming out there to help people maybe cut down on costs or make it easier to get people to make appearances at depositions and get your witnesses without a huge cost during litigation. And in terms of having someone dictate, Dragon Naturally Speaking is probably the leading software for that. So there's a number of options out there that make it easier to use technology or access the courts or other services. And in terms of legal education, there's a number of innovations there too. So you look at, locally we have Mitchell Hamlin with their hybrid program, which is a combination of in-person and online, trying to reach or make it more accessible to people who may not be, living in the Twin Cities or people that have other commitments. Suffolk Law has an accelerator, which basically they make it easier. They work in your last couple years where you start a practice, you sort of transition, so it's sort of an incubator, like CCLI has something similar now. But Suffolk is part of the curriculum. This is just a quote from a keynote speaker at a CLIO conference 2 years ago, basically saying that, diversity, disability is not something you overcome. It's something that, it's just a perception issue. Other people see it as that, but it's not something that an individual overcomes. She's actually kind of an interesting person. If you have time, you can go out to her website and learn more about her. It's kind of an interesting quote, just saying that you don't have to overcome your disability. It's something else that is a different perspective. Kind of changing your lens as it relates to that. So on access to justice, these are some statistics. 86% of low-income individuals can't find or afford legal help. 71% of low-income households have experienced at least one legal problem in the past year. And there's 60 million people in that group, or about 20% of the U.S. population. And it's not a problem exclusive to low-income individuals. For what's classified as middle income or middle class, about half the people have unmet legal needs. So this is why you see a lot of those technology companies stepping in and trying to provide solutions, because there's an unmet need that's not being fulfilled by the current options. This is something that Ed Walters, the CEO of Fastcase, said, that 80% of people with a legal problem are not addressing them with the help of a lawyer, either because they don't see it as a legal problem or because the costs are too high. Now those are pretty distinct issues, different reasons, but it leads to the same result, that people are solving these problems, if they're solving them, or trying to address them without the help of lawyers. And so CLIO 3 years ago released their legal trends report. And so basically what they did is they took all the data, all their CLIO users, and anonymized and in the aggregate all the usage of their system. So they took it and they figured out, over 1 million matters, thousands of lawyers. They tried to figure out, some stuff about, how much your lawyer's billing, how much of your time is actual billable work, how much are you getting paid for, things like that. And then last year, or 2017, they added a consumer survey piece to that. So they took the objective data, which is the basis for the report, finding that on average lawyers only get paid for 20% of their time. They only, of their time, it's like, I think, 2.3% of their time is actually on billable work, and they only bill for like 1.9% of that, and they only collect 1.8%, so you have your collection rate, utilization rate, things like that. So a lot of lawyers' time is being spent on other things, and so they started looking at what tasks are they on, and they surveyed lawyers, but then they also went out to consumers to help lawyers understand the market better. So you look at how consumers are finding legal help or finding lawyers. Referrals from family and friends are still a big part of that. But then you're looking at online search engines, and lawyer directories are right up there too. So those are the most prominent ones. And if you look at the bottom is billboards, radio ads, and TV ads. So those are still out there. People still do it. Presumably it's still successful. Hopefully, they're looking at their ROI to figure out, what methods are effective. But you have to kind of understand, what type of consumer you have or what type of client you're looking for. And so this is kind of showing the way the consumers are trending for how they're trying to address their legal work. So with referrals, more people leave online reviews than give reviews in person. So, and there's several examples of this. We had a speaker that was talking about this specific issue, said that, someone, asked him for a referral, gave a name, said, oh, I trust this person, they did a great job, they're reasonable, they're responsive, it was great. The person went out, looked online, and saw one negative review and trusted that anonymous review more than their lifelong friend that had this glowing review. So it's not just that they're leaving the online reviews, but there's some extra weight or credibility to that medium. So what people are putting in those, Yelp reviews and other things, or on Avvo, can have an effect on that. And so there's a number of CLEs out there. Avvo does a bunch of webinars on how to respond. They say, someone online hates me. That's the title of their program. So what do you do? What can you do? Ethically, you're limited somewhat in your responses, but also, you don't want to just delete it. You don't want to have all 10s on your thing because, people don't believe that. They'll believe a 9.9 more than they'll believe a 10. So 1 or 2 bad reviews isn't necessarily a bad thing. So again, kind of understanding, the way the system works or the way that particular review platform works. You can see that a lot of people trust those online reviews. And almost half the people are going to start their search for legal help online. So, whether that's looking in a lawyer directory or going to Google or YouTube for a do-it-yourself thing, online is where a lot of people are starting the process. That last stat there's a little interesting too, that 1 in 5 people believe they don't need to go to law school to practice law, that it's enough time on YouTube they can do what a lawyer does. So it's interesting, but it's also helpful to understand, perhaps the mindset of your client. If someone comes in, you have to, that 1 out of 5 people potentially that come in are going to think, because they've been on YouTube last night, they don't need you to explain stuff to them. So you have to be able to bring them around or talk to them and kind of understand their mindset. Consumers, again, responsiveness is a big thing. You look at your response to calls and emails right away is what they're looking for from their attorneys. And you actually, Clio went through and they actually broke this down even further in terms of satisfaction. It's if you respond 24 hours, it's pretty good. But they said it's from live to 24, it basically drops off like a cliff. And then it craters after 24 hours. There's they're not good. If you don't call them back within 24 hours, you've lost that client. But it's even more than that. If you don't respond live, there's a drop off within 10 minutes, within a half hour, within an hour. So it's a pretty steep cliff getting down to that 24-hour thing. So again, that's why some of these companies, Ruby Receptionist and Smith AI and some of the other ones are out there offering live reception service, so you can answer and try to address consumers on their schedule. So, and also chatbots and things like that. So, these tech companies are looking at these stats, and so, you want lawyers, if they want to be involved in that or compete, to be aware of those numbers as well. The millennials thing, that's something that Khalil broke down. People talk about, millennials as this big generational difference. You can see here there are some differences. It's not a huge jump in any of those. I mean, I guess statistically you can make an argument that some of those are significant. But they are higher in the ones you'd expect, that they prefer text or email to phone, that they're more comfortable sharing documents online, things like that. But you can see that even, all Americans or across the board, that the percentages aren't insignificant. So, and they are going up, they're trending up. This was, something that the Supreme Court talked to the MSBA Assembly in December, and they're talking about the number of cases filed in Minnesota, specifically looking at the issues with pro se litigation, and that there's an imbalance between the two sides. Maybe one side's represented and the other side isn't. There's usually a discrepancy with a lot of case types. But just look at the sheer volume of cases. You're talking 1.3 million cases. And so if you assume there's 2 sides to each case, that's 2.6 million possible attorneys of record or opportunities for attorneys to represent a client. But we only have 29,000 licensed attorneys in Minnesota. And if every single one of them is in private practice, that means each one of them has to do 100 cases a year, and there's 250 work days a year. that means you'd be doing a case, a new matter, every other day. But remember from the earlier slide, only half of people are in private practice, which means that every lawyer in Minnesota in private practice would have to take on a new matter every day just to fill those potential openings with the volume of cases we have in Minnesota. So there's a lot of data out there, numbers like that, and so you look at some of the options that are out there. There's technology, which we'll get into in a second. Ways to help lawyers be more efficient. If you're only getting paid or doing 20% of your time on billable tasks, that's 80% of your time is being spent on other things. That 80% could help make up some of this. So maybe there's a way for lawyers to take on more legal work, or maybe there's other models. There's the limited licensed legal technicians, the enhanced paralegals, some of those models that other states have looked at, and Minnesota continues to look at. The Washington model and things like that. But there's an access to justice issue, and so technology and other players are looking at ways to solve this. And from the numbers on the surface, it doesn't look like the problem is going to be just attorneys. I think it's going to be attorneys working with other folks. And so just looking at the numbers, trying to objectively measure, can this problem be solved with just the bar? So again, this is a quote from Ed Walters talking about legal services and the perception, comparing it to the early days of the auto industry. And so some of the other players that are out there, stepping in, LegalZoom doesn't have the greatest reputation in the, with lawyers, but consumers, they don't see it as necessarily a big step down from working with an attorney. So LegalZoom has expanded. You can see here's a couple of areas where they speak, and you can actually speak with an attorney. So attorneys are working with LegalZoom now too. So it's not just a direct competitor, but it's also a potential additional revenue stream for lawyers. This is one that I always found interesting. LegalZoom has partnered with Sam's Club to offer an estate planning package for $300. So you can check out on groceries and get your will at the same time. H&R Block used to do their do the taxes where you go into Sears and some other retail locations in the mall that have little kiosks. But this takes it a step further where they're actually working with they're going to where the consumers are. And so, a similar model, the Wills for Heroes program, which was started after 9/11. It's in, I think, 27 states now. Again, they found that, a lot of firms are willing to offer free legal services to police, firefighters, EMTs. But what the program found is that, those people don't want to go to the lawyer's office. So the way the program is set up is that the lawyers go to the police stations and the fire departments and things like that. So again, it's bringing legal services to where the consumers are, or where the consumers are receptive to receiving that help. And so the price point here is interesting, but also the model, I think, of how they're trying to reach consumers. And so one of the things that we're working on at the bar is we've added an estate planning package to our document assembly product, which hopefully allows attorneys to compete at this price point if they choose, and offer superior services to LegalZoom. Avo, another one that's been slapped down by a few states. New Jersey had an opinion about that recently. But they have a couple different things. You can actually talk to lawyers again, or you can search for kind of a Q&A thing and get questions answered online. So there's a couple different models that they're approaching here. Actual legal help versus really a kind of unbundled or very, very limited scope, just a quick legal answer, kind of an FAQ type of model. And Avo's also moved into legal forms. So consumers, which I think anyone that, the first thing most people are going to do when they need a form is they're going to go out and Google it, free legal form or free will or whatever. Or if they're really elegant, they'll put .docx so they don't get all the other websites, or .pdf, something like that. So Avo and a few of these other players are trying to reach that market and provide the forms, assuming that if they need help, then they'll go to one of their, kind of upsell them to one of the other services. So you can see here's some of the pricing that Avo had. $39 to talk to a lawyer, or limited scope work. 15-minute call is $40. Where Avo gets into trouble is the price sharing, or splitting fees between lawyers and non-lawyers and advertising. So they're working on their model to try to work with the licensing boards to make sure they don't run afoul of that. Rocket Lawyer is another one out there. You can see here that they have kind of an Ask a Lawyer service, but they also have some legal docs as well. ReviewMyContract.com. That was one of the, I think, darlings of the tech show a few years ago. very limited scope. Basically, anyone, it was targeted towards small business, but you upload a contract, it reviews it, and it gives you back kind of annotated things with comments on areas to be aware of, flagging language that you might want to change or things that are missing. And so, going back to the Clio report, you can see here that about half the people are kind of interested in having that sort of limited scope thing specific to contracts, but also much more broadly fixed fee. So they know exactly what they're getting, and maybe they're not hiring a lawyer for the whole matter, they're hiring them for a specific task. And so, working with the different bar associations in the state, right now there's a Minnesota Unbundled Law Project where they're trying to do some of that specifically to help people. I think this is kind of that, with the low bono, or kind of that mid-tier, the people that don't qualify for the pro bono work, but that may need some assistance. So if you want more information, you can just go to mnunbundled.org. But that's one area where the bars are trying to work and try to address some of these consumer needs or the way that the market's trending. But again, looking back at Clio, you can see that most people still work by the billable hour. There's a little fluctuation, but it really hovers right around that, 14 to 16% of lawyers offer a flat fee service for at least part of their practice. Not surprisingly, that does vary by practice area. You can see, traffic is obviously the highest. That's a flat fee. Immigration is another one that tends to have more fixed fees, as well as criminal, and then followed distantly by the estate planning type stuff. So an example here, we use this in our document assembly talks. It was an example one of our consultants that did a presentation for us a while back used, talking about, so if you're on the if you're billing by the hour, you get paid, the more hours you work, the more you get paid, unless you're doing a lot of write-offs. And so one of the arguments for document assembly is that you can generate documents, in 95% less time. So there's a huge efficiency play there when you're using document and automation, in addition to reducing human errors, reusing data, things like that. But if you're billing by the hour, efficiency isn't a very strong argument. Other than, your ethical duty, not to overbill or whatever, things like that. But, if you move to a fixed fee, efficiency becomes a huge moneymaker for you. So say, for example, you are charging $2,000 for the preparation of this form. If it takes you 10 hours or takes your staff 10 hours to do that, an effective hourly rate is $200 an hour. Now, if you can reduce the time spent drafting that from 10 hours to 1.5 hours, now you're getting paid $1,300 an hour. So you're spending less time to do it, you're still getting paid the same. So you can work less or get paid more. I mean, there's a number of different ways to work with that stat, but once you move to a fixed fee or a flat fee model, efficiency really can have a big impact on your effective hourly rate and your bottom line. This is, again, an older graphic, but if you've heard the T-shaped lawyer, so traditionally, in law school, lawyers needed to be deep. They needed to have a lot of legal knowledge. They needed to understand, statutes and court decisions and all that, so you were very deep in the law. But in the 21st century, there's an argument that lawyers also need to have that business level, kind of the horizontal. They need to know how to run a small business. They need to, know some, now they're in this graphic, they're using e-discovery, project management, and analytics. So you start looking at big data, things like that. And so it's not just the law that the lawyers need to know, they need to know all these other aspects as well. And so that's kind of illustrated here by the T graphic. And so this is kind of a little bit what I alluded to before, but here's a quote, again, saying that, the industry is being disruptive. Lawyers can either benefit from it or, perhaps be a victim of it. There's if you want to use since it's Minnesota in February and we got a bunch of snow, I like to use kind of the example of surfing. You think of technology as the wave, right? You can either ride the wave or be crushed under it. So depending on what your analogy is, there's different ways to do it. And obviously, you can, hang out on the border or try to avoid it and things like that. But, there's change is coming, and, the wave is going to come one way or the other, and so you just need to be aware of what's out there. The comment 8 talks about, you don't necessarily have to use the technology, you just have to understand it, know the risks and the benefits of it. Again, this is, Kristen came out and talked to us, I think, 2 years ago at our MSBA Tech Conference. She works for Paladin. They do help firms with their pro bono work, keeping track of using software to help them budget for it and plan for it and more effectively manage their pro bono work. And she's often featured as a minority business owner or someone that's running the company. And so, talking about the quote here is that only 3% of venture capital is invested in firms with female founders. So, when you're talking about tech having an impact on the legal profession, what's how diverse or how much, viewpoints and things like that is coming in with that innovation. And so looking at humans, there's a lot of bias, as we know, and there's a number of presentations on implicit bias and even overt bias from humans. And so Harvard has a pretty good test here. You can see they give you a number of different ways to look at it. Unconscious or implicit bias, they can talk about the development of it and how the effects it has. This is one of those slides where I'm not going to read it. There's a lot of words on there, but it basically just illustrates the point that there's a lot of information out there on bias in people or lawyers specifically too. But that's coming into the profession not only from lawyers, but also on the tech side, the people creating the technology. A couple examples of bias, conformity bias. This is an example where you put people in a room and you ask them, which A, B, or C is the same as Exhibit 1. And then you alter it by having 29 out of 30 people in the room say C or B to see if that 30th person is going to change their vote to conform with everyone else. And they find that a lot of times, even though the person doesn't think it's right, they're going to go with the answer that everyone else gave. Appearance is important. There's a bias there. 60% of CEOs in the U.S. are over 6 feet tall, even though it's only 15% of the population. Affinity bias, whether you have the same college or same hometown, or there's some connection between you and the subject. Halo effect. You see this in technology too. If there's one really good thing about an app, that affects your whole perception of that app versus the 10 other things that are going bad throughout the process. You remember that one good thing more than the others. On the flip side, one really bad thing has the same effect where it'll overshadow any good or any benefit. Just talking again, this is more for on the HR side. When you're hiring someone, they're more open to hiring someone where there's again the connection, or you see parts of yourself in them. This one is a little different, where you compare candidates to each other instead of on their individual merits. It happens with technology, or you get requests for proposals where you put them side by side rather than evaluating them independently. Technology can help with this one because you're again writing the rules. So the rules are going to say, evaluate, does this proposal meet these 10 criteria? It doesn't matter if the one next to it only met 9 of them. So there's a little more independence in evaluation with technology here, but that's not necessarily the case when people get involved in the process. The quote from Kennedy there, but basically when things succeed, it's because the person, it's because of the person. If it fails, it's because of some external factor. Like I was late for work because of the weather. It wasn't because you didn't plan ahead or things like that, or didn't take responsibility. It's because of the snow or a car accident or whatever, things like that. Confirmation bias, where you've kind of made a decision ahead of time and then you identify factors afterwards that support that. It's easier to find things in support once you already have a conclusion ahead of time. And here's just an example, again, a lot of text, but this one is talking about racial diversity and the effect of, they use basically the same exact evaluation, but they change the names to kind of imply or have people infer a specific race to them, and then the effect that has on the evaluation process. And names do have an effect, which is why a lot of times in the hiring process, companies now have a thing where they remove the names from resumes. Although you can't remove, relevant factors, your community activism or where you went to school can sometimes imply some of that too. We talked about this a little before, litigation. Docket Alarm had some conclusions here about the diversity in litigation. The other part of this, which I think is a little interesting, and it was starting to see some of that back when I was with the firm before I was at the Bar Association, is firms started to really push for more diversity in hiring and then also in litigation. But part of that is market driven. Where some firms, were proactively going out and looking for it, but other times it was because their big clients were saying we can only consider proposals from teams that have, meet these criteria. And so initially it was, firms that were, had so much diversity, but then, bigger firms could use different practice areas to meet that requirement. And so the market conditions then changed to not only did the firm have to have, whatever criteria was for diversity, but the team working on the matter had to also meet a different threshold. So you couldn't balance your patent work with your, civil rights work, that type of thing. So some of it's market, where, the legal industry is reactive instead of proactive. Obviously, it's better to be ahead of the curve, but hopefully, we get there one way or the other. This is just an interesting aside here, talking about the effect of eating. And this talks about that if that the results varied whether they were reached before lunch or after lunch. So it's not just your demographic data. There's other things that can affect fairness in the legal profession. So circling back to technology. So we've seen some of the things that affect how humans behave. Lawyers being humans. So traditionally, any bias in humans have affected the legal profession. Technology can have social values embedded in design. They can have intentional consequences or unintentional consequences as well. This is kind of an interesting example, technology, buses, and things like that. But in the 1930s in New York, urban planners purposely engineered suburban highways with overpasses that were too low for buses to keep them out of certain neighborhoods. So that's the technology was obviously the highway system, and it was used to affect the demographics of neighborhoods. Again, another design choice that we're seeing today. As the internet evolved, anonymity was the big push, more so than being able to fight crime and things like that. And so the value decisions that were made early on have had lasting consequences. You look at the dark web and some of the other things. You talk about, well, why can't we clamp down on this? Why can't we prevent criminals from doing this and stuff like that? It's because of the design decisions that were made 50 years ago or whatever to create the technology in the early days. So it's not just decisions we're making today, it's decisions that we made in the past and that have carried forward. So you look at the issue we had in the 90s with Y2K, a decision was made in the 60s to use 2 digits to represent years. At the time, the space allocation was the critical factor. Memory costs a lot more then than it does now, and so adding 2 more digits to the year when the year was going to be the same for 50 years, it just didn't justify the cost of doing that. And so all these banking systems and other systems use a 2-year date. But at the time, they believed that their software would only last for 10 years. Well, they probably couldn't have foreseen, or maybe they should have, that their software would still be in use 40 years later. And so that 2-year limitation led to a huge potential risk with our air traffic control and financial infrastructure. So again, it was a logical decision at the time, but had unintended consequences down the road. And so, AI isn't sentient, and so you're going to get algorithms or rules that are telling it what to do. And so you can't write a system that perfectly approximates a human that has that same level of randomness. If you've ever tried to write a random function, you can't. It can simulate randomness, but it's never going to be truly random. An example of this, also even with humans, you won't get true randomness. You ask 5 people in a room to spread out randomly, they're going to spread out equidistant, not random. Because you'll see some clustering when you're truly random, but people don't perceive that as randomness. They see that we need to be spaced out evenly throughout the room to be random. And so it's a model, it's wrong, but it can still be useful. And so that's the kind of understanding we have when we start looking at how to use data and technology. So we have to understand that everything we do is going to be wrong, or there's going to be some flaw with it that we need to be aware of, so that we don't, exacerbate that or, make it worse than it is. And so again, this is a little data, but you're looking at the people that are writing these systems. You look at the average profile for a developer. There's not a lot of diversity there. It's going to be, white men in their early 40s for the most part. 1 to 3 children. 2.4 children, The Simpsons type of thing. And so, it's gotten better over time, and that it should. But there's still that. That's in the early days, the systems that people are relying on were built by this profile. In one example here, there's a document assembly system that was going to do an estate plan for a couple. And at the time it was written, it was only one man, one woman. And so the software would trigger off the gender of the client for the pronouns throughout the document. So if the client was male, then it was always, my spouse, my wife, whatever. And that worked fine until a few years ago when the law changed, and now you couldn't trigger off the client's gender anymore. You should trigger off the individual. And I think it was probably a decision again made for simplicity, but again, it had unforeseen consequences. That maybe they didn't anticipate that the law would change. I mean, it was obviously written. The software was written probably 5-10 years before a lot of that debate came to a head. But again, these things that are embedded in our technology can have an effect or have to be changed as the law changes. Here's an example from YouTube. When they launched, they found that 5 to 10% of the videos were upside down. That's because YouTube is designed, or with phones were designed for right-handed users. So when a left-handed user would take a video, it was uploaded upside down into YouTube. And so, it took a while to figure out what the actual cause was, but again, it was kind of an unintended thing. Specific to the legal profession, this one you might have heard of. This is a pretty prominent example. In Florida, they use system software, look at big data to try to figure out what the likelihood of a defendant reoffending is. And so the interesting one is that, white defendants and black defendants, they both were, the accuracy of the predictions was about the same. About 2/3 of the time, they accurately predicted whether they would reoffend. The problem is that with black defendants, the false positive rate was high, and with white defendants, the false negative rate was high. So the software was more likely to predict that blacks would reoffend when they weren't, and whites were less likely to reoffend when they were. So even though the overall statistic says they're the same, the software is the same bias, when you look at the specific use cases or specific scenarios, you can see that there's a pretty big discrepancy in how defendants are treated with this data set. And so again, here you can look at some of the other examples, LA using predictive policing, trying to figure out a better use of their allocating their resources, trying to assign them to high areas. Facial recognition is one that gets a lot of use. So this was a graduate project from Stanford. They're talking about how accurate they are even when you add beards, scars, caps, things like that, because you're looking at certain points on the face. So it's harder to hide some of those things or fool the facial recognition. You can see the accuracy rate of this one was about 70%, which depending on your reference point could be good or bad. Relying solely on a algorithm. Houston, fired 221 teachers, and there was a lawsuit about that. And part of it is that, which we can get in a little bit later, is the issue with algorithms is that people don't necessarily understand how the decision is being made. It's kind of a black box, and not in the good way, like with the airlines, where the black box tells you what happened. Here, it's like it goes into the black box, and then something else comes out, and you don't know what happens, what's in that box. And so, you get a little bit, with in Minnesota with the breathalyzer, things like that, where the source code requests try to say, what's actually being calculated, how are they doing this, because it affects people's rights. The problem with that with algorithms is a lot of times with these learning systems is that how they behave changes the more data they get. So even if you can see the code, it won't accurately tell you what the system is going to do, because until you start feeding in different data sets, you won't know the actual behavior. The other issue here, this is an example in the UK, where they had an algorithm and they trained it to basically do some of the HR stuff and do some of the screenings for hiring. The problem is they educated or trained it based on past hiring decisions, which weren't exactly equitable. So you were teaching the system based on the past, and the past is what you're trying to correct. So it was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy there that the system wasn't any better than the past. So as we develop these systems, it's important to understand our data. And at the end here, I'll flip through a couple of quotes. One says, you know, technology doesn't need to be aware of that because it should accurately reflect society. And this is the bias that exists in society. Technology should just reflect that. The other side of that is saying that technology needs to be better. You know, we know what happened in the past. Technology needs to help us move beyond that. And so just reflecting the bias that exists in society isn't good enough. You need to be able to take technology to the next level and correct some of that. And so as we look at you know, science fiction, Asimov's 3 laws, you know, don't hurt a human being, must obey orders, and must protect its own existence, but it's a hierarchy. And obviously, anytime you watch a movie or a book, there's going to be examples of how these 3 laws don't work. But it's just the start of a very basic process for defining how AI should operate. And the most common thought problem is the so-called trolley problem. So you have a trolley where the brakes go out. You know, what do? You know, do you swerve to the right and hit the one guy, or do you swerve to the left and hit the 4 people? I mean, how do you make that value decision? You know, as a human, we make that. We may not even consciously make that. But with technology, there needs to be a rule for that. And so, you know, the example in the movie, the Will Smith version of iRobot, was basically that the robot, the police, the robot basically saved him because he had a higher likelihood of surviving, but at the expense of a little girl, because her chance of surviving was much less. Whereas, you know, his whole thing throughout that was that the robot should have let him die to save the little girl, even if the chances weren't as good. So that's that human value judgment that you know, the robot couldn't make. It was just a pure objective thing. You know, the likelihood of, so the algorithm for that robot was written on who has the greater likelihood of survival. And so this is becoming more and more relevant with self-driving cars. This is one proposed compensation formula. So just adding up the different expenses with any accident. And we don't have to get into the math, but they're trying to write code to basically, you know, put that into language that the self-driving car can understand. But here's an interesting implication of that. So if it is a value-based thing, you know, the damage. So if your algorithm is going to determine risk based on financial cost, does that mean that the speed limit in high net worth neighborhoods is much lower than when you're driving through low-income neighborhoods? Because the damages are much lower if you were to get in an accident in the lower-income neighborhoods. And so you can see at the chart here is that if you use this particular algorithm, the speed limit is set based on the neighborhood you're driving through. So you wouldn't have 30 miles an hour in a residential zone or whatever. It would be based on the demographics of the neighborhood you're driving through, which, as you can probably guess, would have some, you know, pretty big implications for equity and things like that. So you look at, you know, how AI learns. You know, war games. To keep the computer from launching, you know, World War III and thermonuclear war, you had to teach them that you can't win at tic-tac-toe. So there, the data set was tic-tac-toe, but it was able to use that to predict, you know, how to win, or the only way to win was not to play with, you know, World War III. And so that's the way machine learning comes about. You have to feed it the right data sets to get the outcome you want. And it's going to learn, and sometimes it's going to learn things that you don't intend it to learn as well. Image classification is another one. There's some examples of big issues Google had early on with their image classification system. So here you can see, for example, you know, fire engines, the 2 most common colors are red and green. You know, partially that could be because, you know, internationally red isn't necessarily the color for the fire engine, but it's also because when you see a fire truck, a lot of times it's in front of grass, so the background is green. And then you can also see that there's, you know, racial things for ping pong and rugby. Aprons are gender-based, although you see it's female and babies have the highest rating for image classification. And so if you're using, you know, the past or feeding it all these images on the internet, this is what the software is learning. That, you know, if you feed it images of a fire truck, you know, if it sees something that's red or red and green, it's probably a fire truck. Or if it sees an apron, it's probably a female or a baby. And so just giving it large data sets isn't necessarily going to let it reach the conclusions you want it to reach. And so here are some of the examples of issues Google had with ads. They had other issues with the images as well. And so this is an example where there's a system that, an AI that basically screens applicants. It speeds up the process significantly, but it's learning. But it's learning from television, among other things. So you can guess what some of the problems would be there. Here's a positive example. You look at Watson and healthcare. It matched the tumor board treatment 96% of the time and significantly cut the screening time. So there are examples, again, this is more narrow and limited use, but it's finding that AI can do things better and more efficiently than humans. Most people can probably connect with this or are familiar with this. Amazon, they're predictive things. They make recommendations for you based on your purchase history, what you viewed, but they also try to classify you and pair you or put you into buckets with similarly placed consumers. So there's a lot of proprietary algorithms and data analysis going on there. Same with Netflix and things like that. But they're using all this big data to try and find ways to get you to buy more or more effectively serve you. And with Netflix, part of it is they want you to go to the less well-known movies because the blockbusters cost them more money. So if you're watching Aquaman, Netflix might be losing money, but if you watch some cartoon from the 80s on Aquaman, Netflix probably comes out ahead. And so there's business reasons behind that too, and that's important to understand that the algorithms aren't working in a vacuum. People see that with Google, the top 3 results are paid results. So it's important to understand those aren't the most positive results or the most likely results for what you want. It's people that are paying for things. So understanding the algorithm and understanding the limitations that are put in there for other reasons, business reasons, can help you avoid some of the misconceptions. And so you're looking here, Accenture announced that 5% of its workforce in 2016 was no longer human. That's 20,000 full-time jobs that were lost to AI. But it's not necessarily a big threat yet, but it is trending that way. JP Morgan, similar stat there, that they're basically moving stuff to AI and other systems, 360,000 hours that have been moved. This is a prediction that 40% of legal jobs will be lost to AI and algorithms in the next 2 decades. Law departments cite a need to increase productivity without increasing headcount. This goes back to that earlier quote that time is finite, but technology is not. But the other thing you see here is that a lot of law departments are starting to use a lot more AI. And so here you can kind of see a couple slides from Stanford about what the different types of AI and systems they're using. You can kind of see right around 2010 is when the big bump starts coming up. But document automation is the light blue. Red is kind of the legal marketplace, so it'd be your Avvo and your lawyer directories, things like that. Practice management is the green, and then you can see legal research is in there too. So you can see that there's a lot of things coming in where they're trying to use AI to find efficiencies or cut costs. So here's just a few of the conclusions they had from that data. Smart contracts is an interesting one. You start looking at e-signature and blockchain as possible ways to remove some of the fraud or make the process more efficient. Former White House Chief Technology Officer spoke at the ASA Tech Conference in December. She predicted that blockchain would be hacked within the next 3 to 5 years. So we'll see if that comes into being. But right now, people are saying that blockchain is one of the most secure systems out there. So there's a couple different things. So computational law is basically when technology replaces people. So this is where the systems are doing the analysis, not just assisting, versus document management systems where a human is still involved. And so you can see this is kind of where lawyers and technology work together versus where technology replaces lawyers. Fastcase employs technology rather than attorney editors. So if you go to Thompson, Westlaw, they're going to use attorney editors to review case law. They're writing the head notes. They're saying good law, bad law, all that. They're using some AI now with their new Westlaw Next to do some predictive stuff, not only for the case itself, but similar cases. So if this one case was overruled, but case 2 wasn't, case 2 will now have some warning flags saying that this case is similar to case 1, so you might want to review that. So they're using AI to extend beyond the direct history of the case. Fastcase, I'm guessing probably for cost reasons, but also to remove some of the bias, uses AI to evaluate that. So in say reversed and remanded, they look for keywords, that type of thing, rather than having a human read those cases. There's a number of other systems out there. Legal analytics is getting bigger. We talked about Docket Alarm earlier. This is, I think, owned by LexisNexis now. Docket Alarm does judicial profiles, so you can see how likely you are, how likely it is that a judge will rule in your favor on a particular motion, how experts that this particular expert has held up in the past, things like that. So there's a lot of analytics out there. We start looking through all the motions and court filings, and so there's technology to help you with that. Interestingly, there was one project that actually took AI and had it try to replicate judicial decisions, and it found that the system was able to do it with a 96% success rate, and it only got one wrong in 32 cases. But again, this is reverse engineering the judicial reasoning. So again, you're having a system that looks backward rather than looking forward. So it's not predicting future cases, it's predicting past cases. So if you're building your system based on the past, you should be able to have it predict the outcome of the past. Where you get in trouble is if you use the past to predict the future, and so that's the next step here is, can you have a 96% rate going forward? You don't know that until 3 years down the road when you have enough cases being decided where the case is either correctly or incorrectly predicted by the AI. Technology assisted review, if you've done any e-discovery, there's a lot of systems out there to help you. If you're not using that, it may or may not be an issue in terms of your professional responsibility, but it's definitely an issue in terms of your cost and the amount of time you spend, because those systems can definitely make things a lot easier for you. Kara is interesting. This is from Casetext, where they're basically helping you do your legal research. So rather than hiring an associate, you can use an AI. ROTS is the same thing, where you can ask a plain text question, it'll do the research and spit back the rule of law. And it doesn't quite draft the brief for you, but I think that's the direction it's going, at least giving you some language that you can just paste into your brief. One partner in New York talked about instead of spending 10 hours, it was basically something that returned the exact same result in just a couple minutes. Online dispute resolution, again, this is kind of getting a little side issue, but eBay, if they had to resolve everything with humans, it wouldn't be able, the system would just collapse. They get 60 million disputes every year that are resolved with technology. And in 90% of those, there was no human input. So 60 million disputes, if you had to have people looking at that, that's going to be a huge cost. And so technology is a way to keep eBay as kind of a free or low-cost marketplace. Chatbots, people remember, back in the 90s, Clippy, the little Microsoft guy that tried to help you, who wasn't really helpful, and most people struggled to, I think most of the calls to Microsoft Help Desk was how to turn that off. So Clippy is a little ahead of his time there, but lawyers act, why are lawyers looking at this, or why do consumers like chatbots? Because 68% it helps them reach the desired outcome, and the 69% said it was an instantaneous answer. So if you're going to do it, this is from a lawyer's perspective, what do you care about, or why should you do this? Here are 5 steps. Personality is an important one. How professional do you want to be? Maybe it's okay if you're a weather bot to have a little flavor with it, but maybe not if you're offering legal advice. So one of the first ones, or ones that got a lot of press, is this Do Not Pay app. So this is a kid from the UK. When he turned 18, he was getting thousands of pounds of parking tickets. And so apparently London, it's hard to park there with legally. So he wrote an app to basically challenge that. And then over time, he was able to contest them. You can see he successfully contested 160,000 parking tickets in London and in New York. And it was dubbed the world's first robot lawyer. So you talk about how much money he saved with this app, but now he's at the Stanford program, obviously. Developing new things. He's developed an app where you can sue Equifax for $25,000. And the new addition, which he announced last year at the Clio conference, is that their Do Not Pay app lets you sue anyone in any of the 50 states in the small claims court. So through the app, you can file a claim for up to $25,000 against anyone else. So you can kind of see the effect that that'll have on things. VisaBot was another one that helped people basically file challenges or work around some of the immigration things that the president put in place. VisaBot has been acquired by Do Not Pay, so they're now working much more closely together. Facebook tried to teach bots how to negotiate. They ended up developing their own standards, including deceptive tactics. There's a lot of interesting things there. If you remember, I think it was Microsoft tried to have a little Twitter bot out there that became a little bit of a lot of hate speech and things like that. They had to pull it down within a couple hours because it learned a lot of things they didn't want it to learn. A couple different aspects you can go to with some of these assistants. One interesting one is that they're all female. And so, there have been studies about that, the psychology of your Alexa and Siri, why is it a female voice, things like that. But they're also learning. So, what you tell them, what you ask, things like that. There's also some data, privacy things with that, how much is being stored about you. And as you start integrating these, if you integrate these into your practices, how much of that is exposing client data. And so there is some voice-driven billing things with the operations of your practice. So I think there's a little bit to be worked out there where the line is drawn and how much privacy comes into play with some of these systems. There's ease of use balanced against privacy. So big data, we've touched on this a little bit. It's kind of a buzzword. Really everything is big at this point. There's just so much data. Storage is such a, there's no cost really to storage, especially with the cloud. But the issue with AI is that it has to learn from something. So the data you feed into it is what's going to teach it. And so if you feed it biased data or data that has had issues in the past, your technology is going to have those same issues. AI is very good at pattern recognition, but again, it may not recognize the patterns you want it to recognize. And again, the example we had earlier from criminal sentencing. This is an interesting one. I used to call it the NPR or the PBS bias. So again, before Downton Abbey, when Nielsen would ask people, what are you watching? Everyone would say PBS because they wanted to sound smarter. So it's kind of a self-reporting bias. And so you can see here, they asked, how many people voted in the last mayoral election? 63% said they did, but the official count was 36%. So it's kind of that self-reporting thing where you want to put yourself in a good light. Even when it's anonymous, people still tend to inflate things that they think are good factors. And so earlier on, I mentioned the Clio Legal Trends report, which is objective data. It's measuring people, what they build through the system, the work they do, their timekeeping, all that. And they found that lawyers get paid for 20% of their time. And they did break it down by state. And so they say the average hourly rate in Minnesota is $240 an hour. And so we did a survey at the bar. We're just rolling it out last week. And we surveyed our 21 bar districts to see, how similar is that data to the Clio data. And obviously, there's going to be the self-reporting bias. We wanted to see how much of an inflation there was. And so obviously, the biggest difference is, people think that they work on billable tasks 67% of the time instead of 20% of the time. But they also then say that they acknowledge that they write off a significant portion of that. So I think a lot of people said that they typically write off about 30% of their time. And then the collection rate gets down the effective rate for lawyers, or their effective hour, what they do, to about 38%. So Clio says lawyers get paid for 20% of their time. Our data is saying 38%, which is actually pretty similar to a FindLaw study, which found that lawyers only get paid for about 40% of the time. They end up writing off 60% of their time. But the common write-off examples, and so we need to go through this, like I said, it was last week, but a lot of times people are writing it off because the client can't afford to pay it, because they're just getting up to speed on something, or they don't want to bill for their research. So there's a lot of those type of common things. And so those are the type of things that, lawyers are saying, I worked on this, but I'm not going to get paid for that. And so that's, if you go to any marketing class, they talk about, lawyers you need to be willing to ask for and collect on what you think you worked on. You shouldn't be, ashamed of that, or, worried that people are going to be offended when you ask to be paid for your time. So there's a psychological piece to that too, but there's some interesting data there. But we'll be sharing more about that at the One Profession events we have coming up throughout the state. If you haven't taken the survey, hopefully you still have the link. If not, just send an email to feedback@minbar.org and we can get you a link there. So again, just a couple of the biases we talked about before. Feedback loop's an important one. As you get more data, there has to be a way for your algorithm to change. Otherwise, you get stuck where your algorithm and your data start to diverge, and you start measuring things that don't matter. And this is what happened. The most prominent example is the U.S. News and World Report rankings for schools. And so they tried to come up with an objective way to compare these colleges, right? But over time, colleges started teaching or designing or budgeting to improve their rankings. So this is kind of the argument with secondary education, that you teach to the test, right? You teach to the measurement. And so your feedback loop, rather than getting you the outcome you want, is getting you, the measurement you want instead. And so there's not a direct exact correlation there. or causation. So you end up, teaching to the test rather than the actual value you want. See, we're at close to the end here. So just one more interesting example here is that the last point, no average. And so in the 50s, the Air Force was redesigning their cockpits for fighter jets. And so they're trying to find the average pilot. So they measured over 4,000 Air Force pilots on 30 different characteristics. And then they picked the 10 that they thought were most relevant to cockpit design. And then they took that and they tried to find the average. And so they found an average. Of those 4,000, how many do you think fell into average in all 10 categories? There wasn't a single one. And until they dropped down to just measuring 3 points, they couldn't get more than 10% of the people to be average. So just because you have an average doesn't mean that anyone is actually average. So again, it's understanding your data. So as a class, there's an average, but an individual, no one may actually be an average person. All right, I can click through this real quick. This is just an example of how you can use data to approximate other measures. So for example, a lot of times you can't restrict based on demographics, race, things like that. But if you restrict by a zip code, you're effectively doing the same thing. So you can see from these graphics here that the zip codes correspond pretty closely with the demographic breakdown of those populations, which is where Facebook potentially ran into a little trouble with their Facebook ads when you can restrict by zip code. So this is an interesting book too. If you want to read about some of this, Weapons of Math Destruction, it goes over a lot of these examples. It's a pretty quick read. I like to call them my bus reads, things you don't need a lot of concentration to follow along to. But yeah, that's a pretty good book if you want to get into this a little bit without too much in-depth analysis. So any questions or comments? All right, thanks.